Have you ever gone to see a therapist and explained your neurodivergent challenges and they just don't get it? Hi, I'm Essie. I'm an autistic and ADHD therapist, and today I'm talking to you about neuroaffirming therapy, what it is, and why it's so important that therapists who work with neurodivergent clients start using this approach. The term neuroaffirming therapy has been around for a couple of years, and in my book, The Neuroaffirming Therapist Handbook, I try to go in depth about what it is and what it involves. The first principle is that every ND is unique. Autism and ADHD shows up differently for each individual. There's a famous quote by Dr. Stephen Shore, which goes, "If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism." And this reflects the fact that neurodivergence manifests differently from individual to individual. While each ND may have some commonalities, the experience is going to differ. And this experience is going to differ according to their personal traits, but also their intersectional identities. Intersectional identities include factors like gender, race, sexual orientation, nationality. All of these aspects of somebody's identity will shape how they show up and how they experience life as somebody who is ND. If you are, for example, someone who is Black, a senior citizen, and a lesbian, you're going to be experiencing multiple complex challenges as a result of these intersectional identities. And it's not going to compare to the experiences of a white cishet woman. When doing neuroaffirming therapy, it's important that the therapist be mindful of this fact and also try to adjust their approach according to the identities that present in the room. The second principle is that neurodivergence is dynamic. Our experience of being autistic or ADHD is shaped by genetics and by environment. For example, there's growing recognition of something called the gut-brain axis in ADHDers and autistics. And what this means is that our gut health affects our mental health and also how our autistic and ADHD traits manifest. I know personally speaking that when I managed my co-occurring irritable bowel syndrome, a lot of my autistic and ADHD traits or challenges decreased significantly. People who are diagnosed autistic when they are children may not actually meet the criteria later in life. This could be for a range of factors. For example, they've spent a lifetime masking, camouflaging, and compensating, and maybe they've developed the capacity to present as neurotypical, or they've adjusted in some way so that the neurotypical traits aren't as obvious as before. Personally speaking, I am going to remain autistic and ADHD to my core to the day I die, but I know that I present very differently to the way I did, let's say, 10 years ago. There's growing recognition as well that trauma and ADHD have a bidirectional relationship, meaning one can influence the other. So this goes to show that ADHD traits may not be fixed, but can actually be increased by the exposure to trauma. The third principle is that pathology often co-occurs with neurodivergence. I tend not to view autism and ADHD as inherently pathological. I view them as different neurotypes per the neurodiversity paradigm, but I know that they can present with some pretty severe challenges. As an ADHDer, I struggle with executive dysfunction. I thankfully have a system in place to manage my ED to the point that I can get by and even be more efficient than the average person. So while I'm all for the neurodiversity paradigm, I recognize that these challenges do occur, and in fact, they cluster and co-occur at high rates among autistics and ADHDers. Take, for example, intellectual disability with autism. ADHD can present with other challenges like epilepsy as well. The fourth principle is that ableism is pernicious and pervasive. What I mean by that is we live in structurally ableist societies. The entire structure of society is grounded in ableism, a desire to prioritize neurotypical perspectives and needs at the expense of neurodivergent perspectives and needs. Advantages and privileges are routinely withheld from neurodivergents, and there are multiple barriers to their success. One of the most offensive examples of this are attempts to cure autism. And while I know that those co-occurring challenges are pretty substantial for some people who are autistic, the idea that their neurotype can be cured is blatantly prejudicial and oppressive. One way that structural ableism manifests in day-to-day interactions is with the 5 ableist S's: silencing, shunning, stigmatizing, shaming, and subjugating. The majority often doesn't want to hear the voice of the minority, and this is very much the case on a societal level, right down to the interpersonal level. A neurodivergent might make a social error, for example, and attempt to explain their perspective only to be silenced and attacked by the neurotypical. When a neurodivergent acts in a way that isn't deemed socially acceptable, they're then shunned and excluded and ostracized by neurotypicals. When you present very obviously as neurodivergent, there's a possibility you'll be stigmatized. For example, if you were to publicly stim in a very obvious way, people might look at you strangely, and then you'd feel rejected and possibly would be excluded as a result. We're also shamed when we fail to meet neurotypical expectations. Classic example of this is the ADHDer who struggles with time management. Each and every one of us, of course, has a responsibility to be on time. But I think it's important to acknowledge that this challenge may exist for the average ADHDer and to provide support and understanding rather than shaming them. And finally, there's subjugating, where the neurotypical puts the neurodivergent in a position of inferiority. And this can manifest in day-to-day interactions in which the neurotypical talks down to, belittles, demeans, or punishes the neurodivergent person. The fifth principle is that ableist standards are often internalized. When we are taught that we should be able to do certain things as neurodivergents, and we can't meet that bar, we shame ourselves. We internalize the toxic messaging that we must be inferior or bad or deficient if we can't meet that bar. And when the neurodivergent inevitably can't do this, they're stigmatized as being lesser than. The sixth principle is that ableism creates minority stress. Minority stress is a term that refers to the unique stress that a minority group member experiences in a society in which the majority oppresses them. A major contributor to minority stress is the pressure from society for the neurodivergent to mask their neurodivergent traits, camouflage them, and compensate for their unique challenges. We end up spending our whole lives feeling like we have to put on a grand social performance just to be accepted. In a sense, these are survival responses. We know that we'll be excluded if we don't engage in them, and exclusion to social beings like humans is a death sentence in many ways. If you think of it from a purely evolutionary perspective, as social beings, our survival is wholly dependent on us being accepted by the tribe and gaining the protection of that tribe. The seventh principle is complex PTSD is common. Complex PTSD develops as a response to being exposed to chronic environmental stressors like bullying and social rejection. Neurodivergents often experience what I call ambient trauma. They live in an environment of ambient trauma in which they're constantly getting negative messaging about their neurodivergent identities, which is then internalized and contributes to this sense of helplessness and shame. And neuroaffirming therapy recognizes that this constant exposure to ambient trauma is likely to lead to severe mental health and physical health challenges down the road. The eighth principle is that rigidity is a natural response. When we look at the diagnostic criteria for people who are neurodivergent, one of the reoccurring themes is that there is a lot of cognitive, that is mental rigidity. There's a tendency to want to stick to routines or certain ways of doing things, and there's a lot of resistance to feedback from other people. I believe this is a trait that comes with our unique neurocognitive profiles, but I also think it's a response to the oppression I've been describing in this video. As neurodivergents, we have challenges with sensory, executive, and social inputs. Day-to-day life requires that we navigate social environments, and we also manage executive functioning demands that we might not be able to, while also dealing with sensory overload. It makes sense, therefore, that we might become rigid because if we stick to certain things, certain environments, certain patterns, we know we can remain safe and not get overloaded, because overload often leads to shutdowns, meltdowns, and burnout. The ninth and final principle is that challenges are biopsychosocial. Discussions about neurodivergence often split off into two camps. There's the social model of disability, which recognizes that disability is created by social barriers. And then there's the medical model, which pathologizes the neurodivergent and implies that the problem is solely within the individual and dysfunction in their brain. Neuroaffirming therapists try to take a wider view and acknowledge that disability is a product of biological, psychological, and social factors. To take a biopsychosocial perspective means not being overly simplistic when we try to understand the challenges that present for neurodivergence. On a biological level, for example, we might recognize that ADHDers and their difficulties with attention and focus and motivation comes down to reward deficiency syndrome, a condition in which there is a shortage of dopamine in the brain. On a psychological level, for example, we might recognize that an autistic may struggle with socializing, not just because they're oppressed, but because they haven't been given the opportunities to practice social skills or the guidance to do it successfully. On a social level, we can recognize that yes, society is oppressive towards neurodivergence, and we can advocate for changes or work with the client to self-advocate for these changes so that they can be more successful. Neuroaffirming therapy is about recognizing structural ableism and validating the challenges that neurodivergents face. It's trauma-informed and attachment-based, and the goal is to take a client from a position of complete disempowerment and help them recognize that they're not bad, that they're not deficient, and that these obstacles that they're facing are real, and that they're not responsible for creating them. If you're interested in learning more, I recommend hitting the link on my profile and checking out some of my books or my blog posts. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and recommend it to anyone you think might benefit from watching it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.